Hello, and welcome to the ConstructorCast, your AGC place for all the news, views, and interviews relevant to your construction business. I'm your host, Leah Pilconis. This is the first recording in our COVID-19 special edition series, where we will bring you timely information on factors that construction companies need to consider as they strive for business continuity in these challenging and unprecedented times. The last few weeks, there's been a remarkable amount of legislative activity on Capitol Hill as Congress responds to the coronavirus. First, in early March, Congress passed approximately an $8 billion supplemental appropriations measure. The focus was on boosting funding for testing and treatment. Shortly after that, Congress passed a much larger bill that, among other things, created a new mandatory reimbursable paid leave program for employers in an attempt to keep employees on the payroll while businesses closed. Then, last night, the Senate passed a massive $2 trillion economic recovery package. It provides significant tax relief to businesses, a huge infusion of money into the lending system, plus another supplemental appropriation for numerous federal programs. Senate staff has announced self-quarantining and staying out of session until late April, but already there's talk of working on a phase 4 upon return. So with us today are three of AGC's lobbyists who have been working day, night, and weekends with Congress on AGC member priorities throughout the legislative process. So they're here today with us to provide an overview of what Congress has produced and what could be coming around the corner. So I want to welcome all of them, and I'm going to invite them to say hello and tell you a little bit about who they are. So Matt, let's start with you.
Hi, my name is Matthew Turkstra, and I'm the AGC's Director of Tax, Fiscal Affairs, and Accounting.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Jim, how about you?
Sure, thanks. Jim Young with AGC of America and the Senior Director of Congressional Relations, and cover a lot of labor and employment issues.
Thank you, Jim. Murphy, your turn.
Hi, I'm Murphy Barrett. I'm the Vice President for Congressional Relations for Infrastructure Advancement.
Thanks, Murphy. Jim, my first question's for you. Can you give everybody listening just a real high-level summary of the new mandates for the employer-fronted federal paid leave? And what we're going to be talking about is the emergency sick leave and the emergency paid family and medical leave.
Sure, thanks, Leah. And I will try and do it high level and try and do it quickly, as I think anyone listening to this or paying attention over the last week or so is a very complicated issue. It's a new program, and it's included, as Leah mentioned, in the second phase of the Coronavirus Acts by Congress, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or the FFCRA. So it does have two provisions in it, two new provisions offering paid family leave and sick leave. Really quickly, effective April 1st through the end of the year, employers will have to provide family leave and sick leave. It will cover, the family leave is a little different. It covers employees that have been employed for at least 30 days prior. The sick leave covers any employee that's worked for a day. And it covers any employer with less than 500 employees. And the reason they chose 500 employees is there's been a number of studies over recent years that most employers over 500 already offer these type of leaves. We are awaiting more guidance on some of the issues surrounding the definition of employees as you count up to 500. Who qualifies for these type of leaves? It covers any employee that's caring for for a child that's less than 18 years old, whose school or daycare has been closed. And that's on the family leave. And on the sick leave, it covers any employee that's been quarantined, awaiting a medical diagnosis, and also caring for a quarantined child or whose child is out of school or daycare. There's also a number of things we're waiting for from the Department of Labor, mostly on how it applies to stay indoor policies and what defines an essential businesses. Those are two sort of outstanding questions. We're waiting for more guidance and hope to have that, or I expect we'll have that before April 1st. And then how long these policies take place. For the family leave, an employee can take leave up to 12 weeks. And on the sick leave side, they can take it up to 2 weeks. And what makes this important is they're going to be receiving their salary or a portion of their salary during this time. On the family leave, they for the first 10 days, it will be unpaid. Then after 10 days, they will receive 2/3 of their pay, capped at $200 per day or $10,000 in the aggregate. On the sick leave, they receive their pay at capped at $511 per day or $5,110 in the aggregate. This is, and they also on the sick leave can receive some pay for caregivers that aligns itself with the family leave. So it's sort of complicated there, Leah. I don't know. Hopefully that made a little sense, dividing the family leave and sick leave together. And then Matt's going to talk a little bit, I hope, in a minute on how the employers can receive tax credits for employees taking the family leave and for employees taking the sick leave. And before he does that, I just want to hit on two exemptions in the law. Again, we're still waiting for more guidance from the Department of Labor. They issued some yesterday. They issued some about 20 minutes before we started taping this this podcast, I think we're calling it. They just did about 20 minutes ago, so we haven't had a lot of time to look over that. But there are provisions in there that smaller employers, so you have the 500 employee threshold, and then employers under 50 employees can petition to the Secretary of Labor to be exempted from that. And then there's some other provisions buried in there. But I will point everyone to the AGC of America website, where we have a tremendous amount of materials and resources on this. And then just this week, on Monday and Tuesday of this week, we held two 90-minute podcasts with some great labor attorneys that got into the weeds on the tax credits and the leave mandates and everything else. And there's recordings of that on the AGC website. I think was going to hit on the tax issues.
Yeah, but first, Jim, just to clarify, so the deadline is April 1st.
Yes.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned the guidance. So there's some that came out earlier this week, more that just came out recently. The things that we recorded this week, webinars, right? 2 webinars as part of our 8-part AGC COVID-19 webinar series. Yeah, the information on the website is tremendous. You did such a great job putting that together. I think everything you covered is reviewed in a chart that's a nice kind of at a glance summary. So thank you so much for explaining that. Matt, why don't you pick it up from there and talk about the tax credits that are associated with the paid leave program that Jim mentioned?
Thanks, Leah. So as Jim mentioned, this is quite a new and rather hefty mandate on employers to pay for all of this leave at a time when construction employers are perhaps either slowing down or in some cases stopped altogether due to shelter-in-place orders or the like. So they did provide a mechanism to reimburse employers for this new mandate, and it's in the form of a refundable tax credit that is reimbursed through the employer share of Social Security taxes that they pay into every quarter. So if folks see a line item on their paycheck for FICA, this is the FICA portion. On the employer side, a 6.2% tax on wages. And we did express some concerns throughout the process that the reimbursement wouldn't necessarily be quick enough to try to get the money back into the employer's hands to reimburse them for all this money that's going out the door. But it's a problem that Treasury is acutely aware of, and they are trying everything that they can to get the money as quickly as possible into the hands of the employers. And that includes a slight change that was made in the legislation that passed last night that you mentioned, the so-called Phase 3 legislation that would allow the Secretary to actually advance money into an escrow account for the employer that in advance of them anticipating that they would have to pay for this leave. So all told, it's probably going to be a little clunky, and we're a little concerned about how it gets implemented. But know that eventually you will get reimbursed. We just hope that it doesn't too severely impact employers' cash flow.
Thanks, Matt. Murphy, I have a question for you. What sort of federal funding has Congress provided in the package last night to combat the immediate impacts of the COVID outbreak on nation's infrastructure?
Well, thanks, Leah, for that question. So last night, as everybody mentioned, Phase 3 passed the United States Senate. The U.S. House is expected to vote on it on Friday. The Phase 3 legislation did not provide huge amounts of federal funding to improve the nation's infrastructure. Instead, it really was focused on addressing the immediate, most pressing impacts of the COVID-19 outbreak on the infrastructure and the transportation system in general. So what it did was it provided federal agencies with additional funding for their operations and administrative expenses, and also is trying to assist certain transportation partners, airlines, airports, public transit agencies with additional funding to either support their operations and in some cases mitigate the impacts of any lost revenue. Specifically, the U.S. Department of Transportation received approximately $6 million in additional federal funding to help with certain modal administration's operations and administrative expenses. The airline industry has received both $32 billion in direct grants for air carriers and other related businesses. And there is also loans and loan guarantees for a broadly defined aviation industry, which includes both the passenger and cargo airlines and other businesses that are essential to our national security. The other sorts of transportation partners that received some additional federal funding in this legislation include the airports. They received approximately $10 billion that will be provided through the existing airport improvement program so that they can maintain operations. And public transit agencies are going to receive $25 billion to fund operating expenses and address any lost revenue from decreased public use of those systems. Congress also provided Amtrak, our passenger rail system, with about $1 billion. Some of the other more notable provisions in the legislation include a long-standing priority of AGCs, which is to ensure that the Harbor Maintenance Trust Funds revenue that comes in on an annual basis is fully spent each year for its intended purpose, which is the maintenance of the nation's ports and harbors.
Okay. Thanks for that great summary, Murphy. So, and before we get too far down the road, so that's in the Phase 3 Senate bill that right before midnight last night passed. And just to close the loop on that, so what are the next steps with that bill?
So we expect the House to take up that legislation on Friday. The House actually went into recess a while ago, and so the House wanted to give members of Congress the option of having 24 hours before they consider that legislation. So that's why we're expecting the vote on Friday, and hopefully it'll pass under unanimous consent. But an individual member of Congress on the House side could stand up and request a recorded vote. So stay tuned on the House activity.
Okay. All right. So busy next 24 hours. Matt, let's talk about a little bit more about what's in that Phase 3. We've got a lot of uncertainty right now with the construction industry, and the hope is that these aid packages, both what we were talking about with Phase 3, but then also Phase 2, that they're going to provide some critical tax relief and some access to capital that's hopefully going to help contractors continue their operations, that they're going to be able to pay their workforce. So break it down for us. Like what are we seeing that's in Phase 3, and then is there more that you want to add that was in Phase 2? I know you touched on the paid leave stuff, but I know there's more you want to talk about.
I'll focus primarily, Leah, on phase three, the tax relief and the lending provisions that were in that. They were really quite large and immense in scale. The tax relief really was focused, if you were to look at it from a 30,000 foot level, on providing employers with additional cash flow, or at least mitigating any cash flow challenges that they have, as well as providing them with additional liquidity through some other measures, which I'll touch on in a second. The most significant provision that they passed was a delay in the payment of employer payroll taxes. Again, you heard me refer to that earlier about the refund mechanism through the refundable tax credit. But the legislation that passed last night also included a delay in how long employers are liable for paying that. Normally, those payments are due quarterly. And this allows you to defer payments of them through the end of the year and then pay them back subsequently over the next 2 years. So that's a fairly significant benefit to employers, I think, in at least not having that. It's one tax that they won't have to pay immediately in this environment. The second provision was something that AGC strongly advocated for, which is the inclusion of something called a net operating loss carryback. And that allows employers to basically go back and amend their previous year's returns, in this case, in the legislation that passed, up to 5 years ago, and any tax liability that they had in any of those previous year's return, if they have a loss this year, which we expect many of our members will have, they can go back and amend those returns and basically count their loss against the gains from previous years. It's a good and effective way for businesses to get money into the business by using this mechanism. There were also some smaller bore but also important things that were related to provisions that passed in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. One provision would basically penalize employers who take out debt and the interest payments on that debt. Obviously we expect people will have a higher ratio of debt to revenue as we go through this period. And so that was temporarily relieved a little bit. There was also another provision that again dealt with net operating losses and how pass-through businesses are able to carry those losses forward. And then something that was a little unrelated to cash flow, but also something that AGC has strongly advocated for, was a fix that was a technical glitch in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act called the Qualified Improvement Property Depreciation Schedule glitch, or it's sometimes called the retail glitch. And that basically unintentionally raised the cost of doing construction projects on things like commercial property, restaurants, and retailers, so that you could write off the cost of those projects in 1 year, versus what they unintentionally did was to string that out over 39 years. So hopefully going forward, you'll have property owners be able to go back and amend prior year returns to get some additional cash into their businesses, but also stimulate construction in that sector going forward. There were also a number of lending provisions in there that I think will be equally important. They appropriated $350 billion to the Small Business Administration to administer a number of small business loans. Generally, this applies to employers that are 500 employees or less, but you could qualify under a different revenue test using the SBA definitions for businesses, which is broken down by NAICS codes. That's capped at $10 million or 2.5 times payroll. And basically, if you're an employer and you acquire this loan and you meet the criteria, which is that you have to use it for payroll, rent, utilities, mortgage interest, that loan will be forgiven. So it's a loan that basically turns into a grant, and we are very hopeful that this could be of significant benefit in these troubling times. There's a much larger $454 billion economic stabilization fund that's also being set up with the Treasury Department working in conjunction with the Federal Reserve that will be used to provide loans and loan guarantees through the commercial banking sector to critical industries, and that we are hopeful will be utilized for larger members. There's not a cap on the size of the businesses that can access those loans. However, those are loans that will not be forgiven. So that those are strictly, loans that are meant to serve as a bridge loan to kind of get us over the hump as the economy slow down before it begins to pick back up again.
Thanks so much for keeping on top of all of it and for breaking it all down for us. Jim, I want to come back to you with another question. Can you share with us what worker benefits and protections did you see in the CARES Act that the Senate passed last night?
Sure, thanks. And as Murphy said, the bill last night was not so much a stimulus bill; it was really a rescue bill of the American worker and businesses. Is more what it was. It was a little light on provisions for employees. We were pushing a number of healthcare provisions and other retirement provisions, and the bill didn't really touch on many of those. It was really heavy on unemployment insurance, extending unemployment insurance to self-employed or independent contractors, which is sort of a deviation from any sort of federal policy in the past. So it was really that was really the bulk of a lot of the employee provisions. On the healthcare side, there were a couple changes to how FSAs and HSAs will operate, allowing them for the first time since the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, allowing them to be used for purchase of over-the-counter medicines and things like that. So that is a positive sign. But it was, like I said, it was pretty light in that area. We expect one thing that the bill did do is it kicked the can down the road, which Congress does often, on some Medicare and Medicaid issues to the end of November 30th. So not that Congress is done legislating on the stimulus side to deal with COVID-19, but again, they're going to have to do something this fall during the lame duck session on the healthcare side. So we should see more policy making at that time.
All right, thanks, Jim. Murphy, I know that your whole team is just constantly working to try to call on the federal government to broadly invest in America's infrastructure. What are the shortcomings of the bill that passed last night? What are the shortcomings you see and things that Congress will need to address through additional relief legislation?
So what we're expecting is, depending on how the implementation goes of these prior 3 phases of legislation, along with sort of what happens outside of Washington, D.C. as it relates to the broader economy and the American people as this epidemic continues, that will probably prompt further legislation from Congress to deal with those impacts. We're expecting at some point another phase of the legislation to possibly deal with the longer term economic recovery that will be needed as a result of the outbreak. And that would be where AGC will be pushing hard to increase infrastructure investment, which has sort of a strong proven track record of providing long-term economic benefits to the economy and also sort of improving Americans' quality of life. So the types of things that we would like to see Congress consider as it relates to infrastructure investment would be additional federal dollars to existing accounts, the Highway Trust Fund, the Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works Program and Military Construction Program, Clean and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund programs. And we would also like Congress to continue to move forward with its respective legislative processes for multi-year reauthorization legislation, most notably the Highway and Transit Reauthorization Bill. The current law that those programs are operating under right now will expire on September 30th. So we really think if Congress could move forward on legislation like that, we would see those sort of long-term economic benefits achieved.
Thanks, Murphy. Thanks for your great work on that. Jim, anything else that you want to wrap up with that you're working on?
Sure. So just quickly, we're looking towards phase 4, which has been sort of teased in the media as early as this morning by Democrat leaders. What we really want to see is some help for on the multi-employer pension side and the multi-employer health and welfare side. As you can imagine, over the first 10 weeks of this year, these pension plans are down significantly with the market downturn, and also that these plans, as many know, are funded through hours worked. And with diminishing hours worked, we're in a real, it's going to be a real concern moving forward. So we're looking for an immediate direct funding of the PBGC, which is a federal agency that oversees some of these multi-employer plans. Looking for direct funding there. Looking for the plans to be able to actuarial smooth these plans. That would really help out what were healthy plans only a couple weeks ago. And a long-standing AGC priority is adoption or authorization of a new plan design or composite plans is really what we're looking for. We hope to see some of that in the next bill as we not just have the stimulus effect of more infrastructure, but at that point, we're going to see these plans have we're going to be able to see the impact of the plans on the market returns and the diminished hours. And the same goes for the healthcare side. We were really disappointed there was nothing in this package to address the multi-employer health side. We're looking for some COBRA premium assistance provisions and funding. Some of those were in bills in the Great Recession in 2009, 2010. We were hoping to see that again. That fell out very late in the process. So again, those are really provisions that will help signatory contractors out there.
Well, thank you all for your tremendous work and dedication and all the time and effort that you continue to put in. The whole entire AGC staff has been working very hard for the membership, and you're all just incredible in what you do. Sorry for any of the little technical or sound glitches you might have heard. As you can imagine, we're all calling in from different locations, but want to thank you all for listening. This has been a special episode of the AGC Constructor Cast. Please subscribe to ConstructorCast from your podcast app, or you can stream all available episodes right from your computer at www.agc.org/ConstructorCast. Stay safe, everyone. Stay healthy. And thank you all for listening to us to stay informed.